Ambassador Lane at that time saw the betrayal of the American people and the Polish people by our government. He protested to Washington. Eventually, he resigned his job to write a book which was called I Saw Poland Betrayed. That book was only, I think they had about 5,000 copies, and they were quickly disappeared. Nobody would touch it. Now, this was an American ambassador, and we should have listened to him then. I've heard the story, whether it's true or not, that Bliss Lane died of a broken heart over that affair. At this point, I'd like to ask Bill Nowers to come up and introduce our speaker. Bill?
Thank you, Dr. Hutt. Ladies and gentlemen, there are but a few times in history when a person of extraordinary character steps from behind the drawn curtains of foreign policy to tell the truth. Many of you may know about the first such person to do so, as Dr. Hutt just mentioned, Arthur Bliss Lane, who was U.S. Ambassador to Poland. He spoke honestly about the U.S. betrayal of Poland, which he documented in his book, I Saw Poland Betrayed. The second such person is with us tonight. From 1981 to 1985, he served as U.S. Ambassador to Romania, having been appointed by President Reagan. Our speaker resigned from the ambassadorship to speak out against U.S. foreign policy and his collaboration with communist dictators. He has addressed hundreds of audiences across the country, warning of the external communist threat and of the insider betrayal of America. He has been featured on national TV and radio and has written several books on this subject. Pinstripes and Reds, If the Blind Lead the Blind, and his latest book, Betrayal of America. Our speaker received Fulbright and IREX fellowships for study in Romania. He served as U.S. Information Agency officer and received his PhD in History and International Studies from the University of South Carolina. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome a great man who has the courage, integrity, and patriotism to tell it as it is, Ambassador David Funderburk.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, fellow Americans. There are two main points that I would like to make tonight. One is that caution and skepticism, not euphoria, should be the order of the day with regard to what's happening in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. And the second point is that America's foreign policy has not been in the best interest of the American people or in the best interest of those seeking freedom in communist lands, but it's been in the interest of a tiny minority who have had more financial concerns, and it's been in the interest of a few communist dictators. So let's look at the announced death of communism and the legacy of communism and what America's foreign policy has been. We've all been shown on American television that communism is dead, the Cold War is over, we won the victory, so now we can unilaterally disarm and join hands with the Soviets and the United Nations to create a new world, or whatever they want to call it. We've been shown on a regular basis that not only has communism died in the Soviet Union, but that now they have democracy, that power no longer resides with the central government, but power is in the republics, that the KGB under Yeltsin and Gorbachev has been transformed into a harmless organization, and most recently that the Soviet people are going to starve this winter, or may starve this winter, and therefore we have to rush with a massive bailout of the Soviet people. But we don't necessarily have to be conned again and again, and so I would say that before we close the books on the Soviet threat, let's consider some of these items which we don't see in the major media. As Gorbachev returned from the so-called coup in the Crimea, he said, I am still a communist, or I still think socialism is the right way. You know that on the ABC National Town Hall meeting, both Yeltsin and Gorbachev said, "We are atheists." Well, that might not, disturb anybody in America, but you see, the fact is that from 1985 to 1991, Gorbachev has been presented to us as a virtual closet Christian, one having been baptized by some Orthodox parents or grandparents. Gorbachev Yeltsin's new KGB chief, Vadim Bakatin, quietly said recently that he would not be releasing the files of any agents or intelligence activities. And, as a matter of fact, he has kept on virtually all of the same KGB agents that were there before. So this is the same KGB that has killed over 20 million people in the Soviet Union. It's the same KGB that today has more agents in Moscow alone than all of the FBI and the CIA agents worldwide combined. So this might be a test of whether the KGB is really reforming and whether things are really changing under Gorbachev. Does anyone really believe that the new KGB chief, the Yeltsin-Gorbachev KGB chief, is going to release the files on Lee Harvey Oswald? Does anyone believe that he's going to release the files, the true story of what happened with KAL-007 and the fate of Larry McDonald, or what Alger Hiss told the Soviets, or what senior U.S. and West European politicians were on the Kremlin payroll? Do you think any of these things are going to come out? Certainly not. If anything comes out, it's going to be a product of the largest department of the KGB, disinformation. You know very well, so I don't have to recount the details of how many missiles and how many tanks and how many ships the Soviets have built under the one described by the American media as Gorbachev, the great, the good, the Democrat, the liberalizer, the peacemaker, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, the one we all love. Well, in the words of some people in the Soviet Union who have been seeking freedom, not in the words of the American media, which hasn't spent much time in the Soviet Union to learn the Russian language or about the culture or history of the Soviet people. Garry Kasparov, world chess champion and co-founder of the Democratic Party in the Soviet Union, said Gorbachev has not carried out a single reform in the Soviet Union which would have led to diminish the totalitarian system. And as you know, Elena Bonner, the widow of perhaps the last real Nobel Peace Prize winner in the Soviet Union, Andrei Sakharov, Bonner said, Gorbachev will probably go down in history not as the architect of perestroika, but as the architect of genocide. Now, why would she say that about Gorbachev? This is Gorbachev, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, the one we've been told is a Democrat liberal reformer. Well, if you look at the Helsinki Watch report in the New York Review of a few months ago by Jerry Leiber, the American head of Helsinki Watch, she recounts 5 massacres that were undertaken by Mikhail Gorbachev inside the Soviet Union, just to give the different perspective on what they think in the Soviet Union about Gorbachev and what he's actually been doing as opposed to what we've been shown. So that accounts to some degree for why the only 10% of the people in the Soviet Union support or favor Mikhail Gorbachev, whereas he's been sold and packaged and marketed so well in the United States that 75% of Americans favor and support Gorbachev. But where he lives and where they know him, his support is about 10%, which should say something about the reality of what is going on. Well, the head of the American Communist Party, Gus Hall, said recently, socialism and communism are not dead, they are on a detour. Political life is something like a garden. Socialism is not an annual, it is a perennial. You can cut it, but it will come up again. George Marchais, the head of the French Communist Party, said, quote, more than ever, I am a communist. And Julio Anguita, the head of the Spanish Communist Party, said, once a communist, always a communist. Well, Alexander Solzhenitsyn put it this way. He said, for those who think there's going to be free enterprise, market capitalism, and democracy in the Soviet Union, he said there is no foundation for democracy here in the Soviet Union. There is no political discipline. There is no feeling of repentance. And this is a key that I'll come back and refer to. He said the most terrifying thing of all is that the last 3/4 of a century, the destruction of the souls of most of the people in the Soviet Union. Well, what about the recent developments in the words of some Russians themselves? I mean, admittedly, some things have changed in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. But Russians say they can throw away all of these symbols. They can drive the Communist Party underground, but what difference does it make? Quote, just because all of these people are leaving the Communist Party does not mean we are suddenly living in a democratic country. And, quote, I am sure the same people will be running things, they just won't call themselves communist anymore. And so, in fact, most of those who are still running things were communists yesterday and today call themselves something else. So, in the words of the American Society for the Defense of Tradition, Family, and Property, they said, communism is not dead, it is yet a living danger. It has had over 70 years to learn from its mistakes, and the biggest mistake of all was to go around calling itself communist. It's much better to call yourself a socialist or a self-manager or whatever, they say. Well, of course, there are still some people in the world who call themselves communist in China, in North Korea, Vietnam, Cuba, and some other countries. But I think one of the best tests of how things may or may not have changed in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe is to go over the legacy and what is going to be done by you and me and the rest of the world about that legacy of Soviet communism and Chinese communism, for that matter, over the past 3/4 of a century. It is the legacy of tens of millions of people killed, thousands of clergy killed, 40,000 churches destroyed inside the Soviet Union, and most of the people stripped of their religious faith. Even where people are not at this moment in physical bonds, many of the people are still in mental and spiritual chains from these decades of Marxist-Leninism, secularism, economic determinism, and atheism. So the question is, would you trust the leader, the head of a regime, which is responsible for the deaths of 30% of the clergy in that, 50% of the clergy in that country, the destruction of 80% of the churches, and admittedly, even by them, the murder of 40 million people. Other estimates go to 60 million. This is just in the Soviet Union. So this would mean, if we put it in the context of the United States, that 1 out of every 4 persons would have disappeared or been killed over the past few decades. Every family would have been affected by it, and every family would never forget it. So this is Mikhail Gorbachev. This is the legacy that he has inherited, and this is what he has chosen to preside over. He has never refuted this legacy of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union, which has killed more people, destroyed more churches, and imprisoned and killed more Christians and believers than any other government in world history. Beyond the human deaths and beyond the destroyed churches, again, it is the spiritual damage done to the people that is almost beyond comprehension. And if you're looking for reasons why the new Bush plan and Gorbachev plan, the massive bailout, the grand bargain with Harvard University's Kennedy School, which is going to teach the Soviets how to operate free enterprise and market capitalism, to see why this is probably not going to work in our lifetimes, you can look and see that under atheistic Marxist-Leninism, bribery, corruption, black marketeering, lying, cheating, greed, learning how not to work, and mistrust of one another became the way of life for most of the people inside the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. And this cannot be changed overnight. So the legacy and the record of Soviet communism cannot be just forgotten overnight and swept under the rug by the American media and the American government. What has kept communism in power in the Soviet Union during the past 74 years, in large measure, we could say, are the unindicted co-conspirators, or the fellow travelers, as Cal Thomas put it. What about if we want to measure, and again a test for whether or not communism has been erased from the Soviet Union, let's apply this test. What about Nuremberg trials for those who took part in the murders of 60 million people or 40 million people? Well, you and I know, I mean, it was important in World War II. Hitler, under the Nazis, was, we understand, responsible for the murder of 6 million Jews. And we all wanted Nuremberg trials to be held so that these people could be brought to justice and the world would never forget. And this memory would stay with us. We could see it forever, and that was right. But if 40 million or 60 million in the Soviet Union were murdered by this evil communist system, then why shouldn't there be Nuremberg trials to bring the executioners to justice there? Well, you and I know that it's probably not going to happen because, as they say in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, the beast or the monster is not yet dead. Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote in the Gulag Archipelago, quote, "For the sake of our country and our children, we have the duty to seek them all out and to bring them all to trial, and to compel each of them to announce loudly, 'Yes, I was an executioner and a murderer.'" Well, if communism is truly dead in the Soviet Union, then Gorbachev and Yeltsin and the other communist leaders should be indicted, convicted, and punished. And Richard Wurmbrand, in The Voice of the Martyrs, put it this way: Lenin by himself, or Stalin by himself, or Andropov by himself, could not take machine guns or guns and go out and kill millions of people themselves as individuals. They had the help of millions of informers, police officers, henchmen, newspapermen, and authors who justified the killings, poets and clergy who sang the praises of the dictators, people who marched in demonstrations cheering them, and all of those who voted for them, probably 99.5%. So it's no wonder that Václav Havel in Czechoslovakia said, you know, our biggest problem is that we're all guilty. Our biggest problem is that we all collaborated with the communist system. Well, they all did not, but a tremendous number did. There were many that I saw who refused to collaborate, and they paid for it with their lives in many cases. So with this legacy, it's pretty difficult to believe that free enterprise, market capitalism, or political democracy can take hold among the masses in the Soviet Union anytime soon. Well, what about the so-called coup that took place in August in the Soviet Union? Well, it was described in the American media as a great people's revolution and a coup led by those seeking democratic government and freedom. And if that's the case, then it's rather strange that only 200 Muscovites turned out in a city of 10 million initially to surround the tanks that Yeltsin got on eventually around the Russian Parliament building. The 200 grew to 20,000, but 20,000 out of 10 million doesn't seem like a million in the streets demonstrating for freedom or democratic government. Even some people in the Soviet Union pointed out that, you know, the majority of people were obviously apathetic, or they weren't concerned, or they were standing in lines trying to find food, but they certainly were not demonstrating for freedom. So much for a people's revolution for democratic government. And then if we believe that hardliners staged a real coup which failed, and this is the way it was presented to us, you know, of course, in the media, then we would have to accept the idea that those who inherited this legacy of killing 40 to 60 million, destroying 40,000 churches and so forth, half the clergy, who carried out an efficient KGB operation of being able to keep people repressed, intimidated, under control, soldiers following orders, and everybody with their heads bent over and so forth, that all of a sudden, after all the years of being able to do what they wanted, it was amateur night in Moscow. And all of a sudden they could not secure the airports, cut off telephone communications, killed Yeltsin or Gorbachev. They even gave a video to Gorbachev to play with in his Crimea dacha. And, of course, you would have to believe that the soldiers who refused to carry out the orders of their bosses, the so-called coup leaders, all of a sudden they had courage, and all of a sudden they wanted to disobey their officers after 74 years of blindly obeying their officers or being shot. So this is, it's a lot to have to stretch to believe. Even many knowledgeable Soviets themselves, not all of whom can be trusted, but nevertheless many of them believe that Gorbachev was in on the planning of the coup or took part in the coup to some degree. And they include Edward Shevardnadze and Garry Kasparov, the president of Georgia, and many of the leaders of the Moldavian Republic. So it is rather curious that I read in a newspaper last week that some insiders surrounding Gorbachev said, "We certainly hope there will not be a trial of the coup plotters, because Gorbachev will probably be implicated if there is." But the bottom line, the result of the so-called failed coup was the virtual deification or re-deification of Yeltsin and Gorbachev in the West, in the United States, and the rush to push through more sympathy for them to grant the aid and the bailout assistance that they need. Well, some curious items about Mikhail Gorbachev's list of requests for assistance this winter from George Bush. First of all, Americans are always given the idea, and of course we're very generous people and we care about assisting people wherever they are around the world if they're in need. So we're told that we have to help the poor Russians so they won't starve this winter. We were told we had to help the poor Chinese so they wouldn't starve. And we were told we had to help the poor Poles and the poor Romanians and so forth, which is all well and good if the money ever went to those who were in need, but it never does. So there's several problems here, one of them being the Wall Street Journal reported a few weeks ago that of the $1.5 billion which we sent to help the Soviets avert starvation last winter, that over 2/3 of it went to black marketeers and to the communist nomenclatura, the communist bureaucrats. So most of it never got to anybody who needed it, even if they did need it. And there are many agencies, the International Council of Wheat in London, a former Undersecretary of Agriculture of the U.S., and others who have stated the Soviets are not on the verge of starvation this winter. There may be some hunger in some of the major cities because of the distribution system, but Russians have been hoarding food for a long time, certainly in the rural areas. And there is going to be nothing even in the cities that would in any way approach what you see in Bangladesh or Ethiopia or other such places. So we're going to rush to send the money to Gorbachev to help keep Gorbachev in power, but it won't go to help any poor Russians who might need it. And this is what I saw when I was ambassador in Romania, that we were granting MFN to the communist regime of Nicolae Ceausescu, and the money and the assistance that he got from that was not really going to help the people in Romania. It was going to help Ceausescu and his Swiss bank account and some of the anti-American, anti-freedom activities that he was carrying out. Well, it's very interesting that if the Soviets were on the verge of starvation this winter, then why wouldn't Gorbachev's list have been a request for dried milk, for flour, for bran, for other types of food, beans, the type of food that you need if you're near starvation? His request included cigarettes and butter, and they have been described as political food aid. In other words, since bribery is rampant and the form of currency in the Soviet Union is often cigarettes, it's important for Gorbachev to get cigarettes to get to his Communist Party friends and others in his bureaucracy so that he can maintain support among them. In fact, if the Soviets were really in need of food, and if they were serious about disarming, then obviously they could start reducing their defense establishment, which under Gorbachev, the good, the great, the liberal, the Democrat, the peacemaker, in the last year from 1990 to 1991, their military spending went from 26 to 36% of the GNP. Ours was going down below 5%. So they could take a little bit out of the defense budget and move it over into the, the domestic sector. Other factors in this are that the Soviets owe $68 billion to Western creditors, including us, Western Europe, and Japan. They haven't paid it back. They're not going to pay it back. So why shouldn't we go ahead and send them $68 billion more, which they won't pay back? It's just global monopoly money that our banks and our subsidized world banks can play with, right? since they don't have to pay it back and they don't worry about it. In fact, that's what one of them privately conceded to me, that, you know, we don't care if we ever collect this money or not. As long as we get the interest, we can roll over the debt, it looks good on the books, that's what we're about. So see, that's what they're doing in part with our money. Here we are supposedly in a recession. Government spending is higher than ever, taxes are going up, local, state, federal. I was in Hartford, Connecticut and Boston, Mass. Last week, and they were demonstrating against taxes there. That seemed to get the people's attention. So with this going on, we're talking about the massive billion-dollar bailout of the Soviet Union, when probably the best thing we could do would be to start working on deficit reduction so that our children's future are not already mortgaged and destroyed. Well, there are three cases in my new book, Betrayal of America, that I really focus on with regard to America's foreign policy and America's foreign policy appeasement by the foreign policy establishment. And they are Communist China, the Soviet Union under Gorbachev, and Romania under Ceausescu and now Iliescu. And in each case, as has so often been the case throughout our history, we don't have a government, an administration, or a State Department, or foreign policy apparatus that has put the interest of those people seeking freedom in the communist countries first, or which has put the interest of the American people and the principles and values that we stand for. But always, it seems, they put the interest of the communist dictators and the interest of a handful of major businesses, banks, corporate heads, or the establishment or the elite, or whatever you want to call it. So to start with the case of Communist China, and to put this in the words of those seeking freedom in each one of these areas, this will help demonstrate the points that I'm trying to make. And that is, under George Bush and the State Department and the foreign policy establishment, our policy has been one of appeasing and rewarding some of the great monster communist dictators in history, Deng Xiaoping and Li Peng in China. So this is essentially the way that it occurred. In June of 1989, on one day, Deng Xiaoping moved the tanks into Beijing and declared martial law. Now, to most people in the world, there would certainly be a signal that these hundreds of tanks there were not there just for fun, but that they probably intended some harm to somebody. But to George Bush, the idea was, well, we've got to continue to reward and appease our good close friend, Deng Xiaoping. So 11 days after martial law was established, George Bush declared that we would grant most favored nation status to Beijing again. So then a few days later, having been armed with the green light, the go-ahead light of appeasement, Deng Xiaoping and Li Peng opened fire, and the thousands of students are killed in Tiananmen Square. And it didn't just end there. I mean, obviously, this policy was designed more because of the close friendship with Deng Xiaoping and Li Peng, but also because we have 450 major businessmen and corporations who are doing very well off of slave labor in China and doing very well off of monopoly arrangements that they have in Beijing, including, of course, George Bush's brother, Prescott Bush. And it's no surprise that the two principal architects of George Bush's foreign policy were the first ones to run over quietly, secretly. James Baker lied to us about that, of course. Secretly to Beijing to click glasses with Deng Xiaoping and Li Peng, and in effect tell them, no doubt, that don't worry about this blood in Tiananmen Square. We're not going to let that affect American foreign policy and our assistance to you. So when Lawrence Eagleburger and Brent Scowcroft traveled to Beijing, this was what was taking place. Well, you have two individuals there who are, again, the principal architects of the foreign policy, and we see what they're doing in terms of our policy vis-a-vis these communist countries. Well, we can go back and see that maybe they don't reflect or represent what most American people thought they were getting when they elected a president in 1980 or 1988, for that matter. Lawrence Eagleburger was appointed U.S. ambassador to Yugoslavia by Jimmy Carter. So it's no surprise that a Carter appointee, who later in 1986 gave the maximum financial contributions to a liberal Democrat running for the U.S. Senate in North Carolina, as a matter of fact, it's no surprise that Bush, the conservative Republican, would be using as his Deputy Secretary of State to carry out foreign policy, one who was and who gives to Democrats, any more than it's surprise that Robert Strauss, Democrat from Texas, the so-called Arm and Hammer with the Texas accent, was sent to Moscow by this conservative, so-called conservative Republican administration. Well, it's my understanding that Robert Strauss has interest financially in Martin Marietta Corporation, which has been doing very good business with the Soviet communists before and under Mikhail Gorbachev. So for you or me, this would probably be a conflict of interest in the same way that it would have been for Lawrence Eagleburger and Brent Scowcroft, who, by the way, from 1985 or 86 to 1989, they took a little break from government work in the State Department and the NSC and became respectively chairman and vice chairman of Kissinger Associates consulting firm. Eagleburger reportedly made about $1 million a year. Scowcroft about $500,000. New York Times even called me and said this sounds like a conflict of interest because they're using insider information. They're setting up deals with communist countries and corporations in the United States. So you could read in there that Eagleburger was on the board of a bank in communist Yugoslavia and also Yugo America Corporation and so forth. So I'm just posing the thought and the idea here that maybe there's something more, to the motives behind some of these people who are running American foreign policy than just ideology, for that matter. In terms of Romania and in terms of China, I could say that the Bush foreign policy and the foreign policy establishment of Eagleburger and Scowcroft have actually granted MFN in violation of American law. So that in the case of China, even one of our major media channels slipped up and did a report which exposed slave labor in communist China not too long ago. And they showed the extensive prison gulag of many political and some religious prisoners who were working to produce products which are dumped on our market, putting our people out of work, and produced by slave labor. Well, our law says that we can't grant MFN to a country which engages in slave labor, but of course we are doing it, obviously for various reasons. And in the case of Romania, when I was ambassador, we were granting MFN to Ceausescu's Romania, contrary to the Jackson-Vanik Amendment and American law, which said you can't give MFN to a country that doesn't practice free immigration. And there, Ceausescu was selling Jews from Romania to Israel and Germans from Transylvania and the Banat regions of Romania to the Federal Republic of West Germany for $12,000 to $14,000 per head in clear violation of American law, and this was well known to Reagan, Bush, and the others in the administration. So in each case, in the eyes and in the words of the people, whether it's Li Lu in China who says Bush is giving a green light or gave a green light to the communist dictators to massacre these people, or whether it's President Landsbergis in Lithuania who said when George Bush took American troops to the Persian Gulf to make the Persian Gulf safe for, what should we say, safe for the oil mogul friends of Bush, Mosbacher, Baker, Bush, or should we say to make the Persian Gulf safe for the rich Arabs, the emirs of Kuwait or the sheiks of Saudi Arabia. Of course, I lived a few years in West Texas, and George Bush was in West Texas drilling for oil with his daddy's money, and he founded an oil company called Zapata Oil Company, and it just happened to be the first one to drill offshore of Kuwait. So it just could be that there might be a little place in his heart or a little sentimentality through the years for the emirs. But, it's nice to liberate people, but in this case, we didn't go to liberate somebody into freedom or democratic government. You see, the last I heard, there are no free elections in Kuwait, and we still have the emirs in charge. And while that sideshow was going on, George Bush was talking to Mikhail Gorbachev and giving him the green light to let the Black Berets land in Vilnius and Riga in Lithuania and Latvia and massacre a few people who were seeking freedom, to the point that Landsbergis said George Bush's policy, this was in January of this year, right in the middle of the Persian Gulf War, Bush's policy vis-a-vis Gorbachev and the Baltics is a policy of Munich, a policy of appeasement. And in essence, this is what our policy was vis-a-vis Ceausescu. Everybody in Romania knew he was a monster. Everybody knew he was destroying churches, killing pastors and priests, running drugs, exporting terrorism, exporting military arms around the world, carrying out bizarre policies of typewriter decrees, scientific diets, requiring every woman to have at least 5 children or pay fines and things of that nature, and building his palaces with some of the money from selling Germans and Jews and some of the money from MFN that went into Romania, while those who were really seeking freedom and a more democratic form of government were often suffering in a vast gulag of over 1 million people working on a canal, the Danube-Black Sea Canal, where most of them were lost and forgotten. So you see, when many of these people from Romania and Hungary and Poland, the Soviet Union, and China come to the United States, the first thing they say is that what we're seeing on the major TV screens and what we're reading in the major papers is not consistent with the truth that we've lived, the reality that we've seen throughout our lives. So I think the question we have to ask ourselves is, how long are we going to tolerate disinformation through the major American media? How long are we going to tolerate the apathy and ignorance of those in the media? And we could look at the Lichter-Rothman study, the media elite, and find one explanation perhaps, which is that most of those who are broadcasting the news to us, and most Americans take it at face value, that this is the authoritative word. Most of those people don't go to church, don't believe in God, think homosexuality is a normal way of life, favor abortion on demand, and blame America first for everything that goes wrong, which is their right if they want to do it. But I'm just saying it doesn't represent the majority of people in this country, as has been shown over and over and over. So they ought to preface what they say with where they're coming from and what their lack of beliefs are, or what their beliefs in a bigger government or socialism or whatever it is, atheism for them, are. So this is one problem. I think we have a lot of assets in this country in this battle to try to get the truth before the American people. And it's also a reality that the people in Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union, and China have learned. Those 40 to 50 million people who have come from those places and lived under communism, they know a reality quite different from what our kids in school are learning, from what people learn in the universities, from what most of the federal government employees seem to espouse, and what the major media and the major establishment elite carries out. So they're well aware of how terrible communist tyranny is and how terrible big government, animal farm are, and they always state the bigger the government, the smaller the individual. And this is what I learned living for 6 years behind the Iron Curtain. But it distresses them that in their minds they feel, you know, they've been sold out by not just the dictators in their countries, but they've been sold out by leaders in America who have put other things ahead of them seeking freedom. So I would think that the problem we face is that one day there may be 1.2 billion Chinese, 300 million people from the Soviet Union, and hundreds of millions from Eastern Europe who will come to us and say, where were you when we were out there fighting for freedom? Why were you in bed with the Ceausescus and Deng Xiaopings and Mikhail Gorbachevs? Why weren't you standing with those of us seeking a better life, or what you have in the United States? George Bush has spent a lifetime surrounding himself with those people who seem to believe in big government, one world government. If we talk about in the State Department, Eagleburger or Baker or Scowcroft in the NSC, or Mosbacher, Schultz, or Rockefeller in big business and banking circles, or Thornburg and Baker in politics, these people who have been closely associated with George Bush have tended to view the world in ways in which most Americans don't. That is, in terms of a convergence of the communist system and our system, so that we'll all be, you know, coming together and be alike. It's almost like Bush intimated during his speech at the UN about 10 days ago when he said, you all really don't need to worry about losing national sovereignty. Us being part of this new world order, with the United Nations as the instrument for it doesn't mean the diminution of America's national sovereignty. Well, I think we know that UN treaties and UN conventions demand that we would have to submit our constitutional privileges and rights to that of an alien body, as one constitutional scholar put it. So whatever the New World Order is that George Bush is talking about, it certainly doesn't seem to have anything in store that's consistent with the individual, the family, belief in God, or a constitutional republic maintaining its national sovereignty in the United States. And so when Bush said 10 days ago that what we want to do is have shared values and standards with the countries in the United Nations. So what he's talking about, in effect, is he said there are 166 nations now in the UN. Most of those, let's say 2/3, are atheist, socialist, and anti-American. So we're going to get in bed in a new order with the countries in the UN in which we share values with them and we accept their atheism and socialism and anti-Americanism. If we wanted to do that, we could go to Harvard. Yes. So we have what you can call a Nixon, Kissinger, Rockefeller, Ford, Carter, Bush foreign policy. It really doesn't matter if you have a Democrat or Republican in there. As they used to tell me in the bureaucracy in the State Department, the Reagans come and go, but we stay. And the Reagans can enunciate and verbalize a foreign policy, and somebody in the woodwork implements the foreign policy, which was a continuation of what was there before. So that's why back in the days of Nixon, you had Kissinger and as the architect of realpolitik and American foreign policy of differentiation vis-a-vis the communist world. And today, you've got Kissinger's two main proteges, those who served as president and vice president of Kissinger Associates running the foreign policy. And again, always on the wrong side of history, on the wrong side of freedom, on the wrong side of the American people. And even, for example, this both Eagleburger and Scowcroft coincidentally served in Yugoslavia. Eagleburger was a U.S. ambassador there. Scowcroft was Air Force attaché at one point. They know Serbo-Croatian. They lived in the embassy in Belgrade. How is it that when there was a choice to make between the central communist government in Belgrade and the breakaway republics that were anti-communist, seeking freedom in Slovenia and then Croatia, that we had to side with the central communist government in Belgrade? That's what our experts recommended. Was it because they thought that would better protect the status quo and stability, or investments that they had had, or connections that they had had in the past, or better to deal with the devil they've always known and liked, or what? Well, I think it's interesting that as one of his first acts as president of the United States, George Bush did not pardon Ollie North, whether or not he deserved it, but he pardoned Armand Hammer, son of the co-founder of the American Communist Party, and one described as the best friend the Soviet communists ever had from the days of Lenin to the days of Gorbachev. So it must reflect to some degree his sense of priorities, or what he puts faith in, or what he prefers. When I questioned technology transfer and human rights violations, I was circumvented by the United States government, and this could well be because it threatened the financial and political interests of the insiders. Well, you know, the major media in this country, which I told you some of the characteristics as described in the media elite. Well, let me throw out one other one, watching them come through Bucharest and knowing from others about their visits to Warsaw, Prague, Budapest, Sofia, Moscow, and so on. You know, the Rathers, the Brokaws, the Koppels fly into these capital cities with camera crews. They spend 2 or 3 days there. They've never learned the language of the country or anything about the history or the culture of the people. They live in the major hotel, let's call it the Intercontinental Hotel, in those capital cities. They eat the only steaks available to anybody in the country in that hotel. They talk to the KGB agent locally who was fluent in English. They're dependent on him. They show the cameras, usually where they are guided to show the cameras, And then they put this on American television, and Americans are confident that they have the authoritative account of what goes on. But it's very selective, you can be sure. Just in the same way that, you know, it wasn't as if Ceausescu only appeared in the world on Christmas Day of 1989 when we started seeing pictures of Elena and Nicolae Ceausescu on American TV screens. And then all of the horrors that had taken place under Ceausescu. Many of these started coming on TV. Well, where were they for 25 years? This had been going on for 25 years. Where were the TV cameras from 1965 to 1989? Well, a lot of such horrors have been going on, due in part to the support and collaboration of the United States government for a very long time, and have never been exposed or looked at in depth by the major American media. Seems very strange. So I think that what Bush is talking about in terms of his New World Order, you know, continues to benefit the same people that he likes to deal with, the other communist rulers in China, in Soviet Union, in Romania, and what they call their shared goals, which I feel certainly do away with what our way of life is. And so I guess the bottom line is we can call them insiders, or we can call them the establishment, or we can call them members of the Council on Foreign Relations or the Trilateral Club or whatever, but the question is, why is it that they always seem to put their own financial interests, their own political interests, ahead of the interests of those seeking freedom, or ahead of the values and principles that we stand for in this country? Why have they never stood or out in solidarity with those seeking freedom in China or in the Baltics or in Romania? And I've spoken with a lot of those people who are still struggling for freedom in these places, and they have considered Deng Xiaoping to be their enemy, Mikhail Gorbachev to be their enemy, Ceausescu and now Iliescu in Romania to be their enemies, and our president and our foreign policy makers have not. They have been in alliance with these. So it'd be nice to see an example of our president and our foreign policy apparatus being in alliance with those seeking to overthrow communism. So it seems consistent for George Bush of Andover, Yale, Skull and Bones, the Council on Foreign Relations, you know all the rest, Congress, CIA, Republican Party, and so forth. It seems consistent that he praised the communist monster Ceausescu, that he supports MFN for the butchers of Beijing, that he has praised Mikhail Gorbachev, the one resented by most of the people in the Soviet Union. It's consistent for the elitist Bush to pardon Arm & Hammer. It's consistent for him to favor taxing middle-income Americans but not his wealthy millionaire friends. It's consistent for him to appoint to office essentially those that he's very comfortable with, who belong to his same elite. I don't have to tell you about the threat that we have in this country with regard to big government. Can you remember a time when government has gotten smaller in your lifetime, or when taxes have gone down, or bureaucrats have been put out of business, or anything like that? On the state and the local and federal level, government has steadily been increasing in size. And the textbooks in this country have been changed dramatically in the last 20 or 30 years, you might notice. And I did a survey one time of what they were saying in the textbooks about the Soviet Union and the communists there. And most of the textbooks didn't even mention that anybody was being killed inside the Soviet Union by any communist. And this is what most of our kids are learning in the schools today, that in essence there isn't much difference between our system and their system. In other words, a system that kills 40 to 60 million and a system that doesn't kill any, as a matter of practice, are the same morally. This is in essence what they're being taught. So something is wrong. You know, up is down, right is wrong. I mean, you can look at the character assassinations going on or whatever you want to look at. And what we've believed in traditionally in this country is under attack every day in the media and in the schools and in the libraries. I mean, a good test of this also is, why isn't an alternative point of view being shown in the major media in this country? Why aren't books like you'll see on the table in the back whether they're The Shadows of Power, The Establishment's Man, or New Lies for Old, or Red Horizons, or Betrayal of America. Why wouldn't you find those books in the public library here locally, or in the colleges here locally, or in Dalton's or Walden Books? Because they essentially have one slant, one ideological perspective that is permitted into these. You know, one politically correct point of view. That's what you have, in essence. Well, there's still a battle going on in the world. It's not just the battle between freedom and slavery here and there, but it's a battle going on right here domestically in this country about whether we're going to wind up being a country that still believes in God and the individual worth and dignity of everybody, the family, which is certainly under siege, or private property, or the constitutional republic. And it isn't just something that we can wash our hands of and say that, well, there's nothing we can do about it. I mean, there are 101 things that we can do about it, from putting the light of exposure on the media which doesn't report the true stories of what are happening, to demonstrating against congressmen or protesting against congressmen who vote for most favored nation status for communist countries, which goes to repress people seeking freedom, or to demonstrate against the banks and the corporations which don't mind loaning money at reduced rates backed by the American government to a communist dictator who kills people, but will not give you or me a loan at a reduced rate so our children can go to college in this country. So one of the biggest assets we have, again, are the 40 to 50 million who come from communist lands, and if we could take them to the schools and before the media, which pays no attention to them, and they've been very demoralized and very depressed, but they know a reality which they'll never forget, and I see them everywhere I go. I saw last night in New Jersey and the night before in Albany, New York, were tens, scores from the Baltic states and from Romania and from the Soviet Union. And they know the reality of what's happening, and they know there must have been some collaboration going on between leaders in the West and the communist dictators. Or why would they have been stopped in the process, and their views and what they sought left out of the equation? So it isn't just the people running the communist system who are the problem. It's that we don't have too many people in Washington who have courage of convictions and who aren't taken over by the power and the money and the pressures that hit them once they get into Washington. We ought to be grateful to this country, and we ought to be thankful to God for having blessed us despite the fact that we perhaps don't deserve it. My father was a pastor, and he underlined in the Bible that he gave to me a passage, Luke 12:48, and it says, "Everyone to whom much is given, of him will much be required." And that is you and that is me, and we've been given a lot, and now we have a lot of responsibility to do all we can to help preserve what was best and what was great about this country. Thank you very much.
We will have a short break during which I'm going to talk. No, I won't do that. But we will give Ambassador Funderburk a few minutes to get a little rest and a drink of water, and he will come back and take some questions from the audience. In the meantime, I want to emphasize a couple of things that he said. One was he talked a lot about the news media. And the real question is, why does the news media always provide only the left side of the question? We get the liberal point of view, and they somehow seem to miss what the average American believes, I think, about things. And I think that one of those explanations is the organization, which controls, to some extent, what the news media prints. Let me get my books. he mentioned these. The Shadows of Power by James Perloff is about the Council on Foreign Relations and the American Decline. It's must reading for anybody who's to really understand what's going on in this country and in the world. The New Lies for Old, in this book, Anatoly Golitsyn, who was a former high KGB agent and who was an insider in the communist hierarchy in the Soviet Union, he wrote this book about 6 years ago, and he predicted the very changes that we're seeing in Eastern Europe, Germany, and in the Soviet Union, the breakup of the Soviet Union. These are things that he predicted would happen, and they are happening. And the reason was that these were planned and not accidental. Another little book, all of these are available, by the way, at the bookstore table back there. The Establishment's Man about George Bush. And in this, I think it amplifies many of the things that Ambassador Funderburg had to say about President George Bush. Last but not least, be sure that you subscribe to the New American. This month's issue is excellent. There's an article in there about soft-selling world socialism, and I think that's kind of must-reading too. Recommend it highly. You've got the program, and in there on the back page there is a subscription blank to the New American, and I urge that you consider going on, and if you don't get it, go ahead and get a subscription. You'll never regret that. We want to be sure that anybody that wants to be on our mailing list, that we get their name and address. So if you have those cards, Dick, would you maybe go ahead? I think we ought to go ahead and collect those cards. Anybody that doesn't have one can get one, but be sure we get you on our list so we can notify you when we have our next speech. And if you're interested in the John Birch Society and what we're doing, there's a place there to indicate that. At this point, Dick Kite is going to come up and say something about the John Birch Society, and then we'll have just a very brief discussion by Tom Parsley. Come on up, Dick, and talk a minute about the Birch Society and what we're all about and what we're trying to do.
Thank you, Don. I guess we covered really some pretty heavy stuff here tonight. I'd kind of like to take this opportunity to tell one of Dick Kite's famous stories. And this guy was out in this rowboat, and he was running along, and he happened to look. He says, well, I sprung a leak, and the boat starts to sink. And this motorboat over here sees him. He sees him going down. So the motorboat comes over, and he says, hey, you need help, you need help. He says, no, he says, the Lord's going to save me. And he says, okay. So the motorboat pulls off, and here he goes, and he's still sinking. So this other boat out here comes over, and he comes over. He says, you need any help? He says, no, he says, the Lord's going to save me. So finally, the boat's really starting to go down now. And water's come up the guy's chest, and a helicopter comes over. He drops that big line down, and he says, you want the line, buddy? The guy says, no, he says, the Lord's going to save me. So the guy sinks, drowns, and dies, goes to heaven, faces God, and asks God, why didn't you save me? And the Lord said, well, he said, I sent you 2 motorboats and a helicopter. I don't know where your thinking was. But without any further ado, I'd like to talk about the John Birch Society a little bit. And ladies and gentlemen, it is with pleasure for me to tell you about the organization that is sponsoring this program here tonight. The motto of the John Birch Society is less government, more responsibility, and with God's help, a better world. Frankly, we think that says it all. We want a better world for ourselves, for our children, and our children's children. What will it take to build a better world? Well, it certainly will take God's help. It will also take more responsibility on the part of us all to preserve and protect our heritage and our freedom. And finally, it will mean defeating the present and would-be tyrants who have always constituted the greatest threat to freedom and happiness. Today, the John Birch Society is recognized by friend and foe alike as the largest, most effective anti-communist organization in the United States. Our program has always summarized, which was summarized by Robert Wells, the founder of the John Birch Society, as education is our total strategy and the truth is our only weapon. As part of our educational program to make more Americans aware of the threat this nation faces, we are sponsoring this meeting here tonight. We think you will agree, after hearing our speaker, that the information presented is of paramount importance. But we also believe that the responsible action must go hand in hand with education. We hope this meeting will motivate many of you to learn more about the John Birch Society. For when you do, we are sure that you will want to become part of this educational army. We think the John Birch Society is the finest body of men and women anywhere in the world. We hope you will join with us, and we certainly appreciate your presence here tonight. And I'd just like to go back to the little story that I just told you, and that if we should ever suffer the loss of our freedom and die and go to heaven and ask God, why didn't he help us? Why didn't he save us? Each and every one of us here tonight should hope and pray that he doesn't tell us, well, I gave you, among other things, the church, the John Birch Society. Where was your thinking? Thank you.
He sneaked that joke in on me. I tried to get him not to do that, but he got by me. Tom Parsley is a coordinator with the John Birch Society. He spends all of his time out in the field talking to people around the state of Virginia and other places, and he's going to come up and say a few words.
Thank you. First, a brief, in fact, this is all commercials, nothing but commercials. Very rarely, but on occasion, we have the opportunity to have the National Council of the John Birch Society meet in the northeastern United States. The last time was in 1985, and on November 9th, we're going to have the National Council meeting of the John Birch Society in Morristown, New Jersey, which isn't terribly far away. It'll be at the Royce Hotel Governor Morris in Morristown, and the reception begins at 6:30 p.m. and the dinner at 7:30 p.m. The two keynote speakers will be G. Vance Smith, the new Chief Executive Officer of the John Birch Society, and also the new President of the John Birch Society, John F. McManus. I think most of the people in this room are familiar with John F. McManus, but this would be an opportunity for you to meet and hear our new Chief Executive Officer, a really outstanding man, an individual that I've known for some time, as well as a chance to meet the members of the Board of Directors and the Council of the John Birch Society, the men that lead and plan the activities of the Society, as well as have a lot of fun. I've never been to any of these that weren't really first-class affairs that were tremendous fun. I have flyers for those of you that may be indecisive as to whether you'd like to go tonight or not, and I'll have some back at the book table and I'll put some at the ticket table so you can pick them up. But if you're ready to go, I have tickets with me, and I've got some excellent tables, and they go on a first come, first served basis. So if you'd like a great table right up front, I've got tickets with me tonight. We've had a number of commercials for the books, and I don't think enough emphasis has been placed on Ambassador Funderburk's book, Betrayal of America. I found this book to be really a moving and inspiring volume. Most of what he covered in his talk tonight is covered in here. And the irony or the duplicity of American foreign policy is so well illustrated. For example, he's got interesting little pairs of photographs. If I can find one quickly here. Here's President Bush clinking a champagne glass with Deng Xiaoping shortly after the Tiananmen Square massacre. Here we have a pair of photographs. At the top are the young people lying in puddles of their own blood, the Tiananmen Square, and beneath it is Scrowcroft and Eagleburger clinking champagne glasses shortly thereafter with the butchers that ordered the slaughter. And the book is filled with such ironic little pairings. If you leave here without this book tonight, you're not really getting the benefit of having been here. Sure, you can order it and pay shipping and handling and write out a check and wait 2 weeks to get it, but you've got a unique opportunity. They've got an excellent book table back there tonight. If you already have the book, consider buying some for Christmas gifts. And the ambassador has offered to autograph any book that's purchased here tonight. So it's an opportunity not only to get a fantastic book, I think it's a tremendous book whether you get it autographed or not, but you've got that extra opportunity. And I think you should really stop at the book table before you leave tonight, because probably a lot of you in here are already convinced of the problem. How are you going to convince others unless you can provide the material? Buy a few extra copies for friends. And as I mentioned, I'll put the flyers concerning the dinner back at the table. Thank you.
At this point, I want to ask Ambassador Funderburk to come back up and take a few questions.
Okay, thank you. You have any questions? Yes, sir.
I certainly agree with what you were saying about the government should support people who are fighting for their own freedom. But I wonder if what was said about the people of Russia, namely that they don't have a foundation for freedom and that basically called into question their ability to deal with freedom, to exercise freedom in any meaningful way, if that's not also true of much, if not all, of Eastern Europe, and if that, because most of those countries had monarchies up till the time the communists came in there, and if that is true, when we talk about supporting freedom movements in those countries, are we really talking about supporting a freedom movement, or are we talking about supporting somebody else's tyranny?
Well, that's a good question, and what you say is valid. Only in Czechoslovakia in the interwar period was there some form of multi-party political democratic system, and to a much lesser degree in Hungary, and then the other countries were pretty much like the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union's history of democratic government went from February to November of 1917, essentially. But that's not to say, and I didn't mean to infer at all, that just because the majority of the people in the Soviet Union or parts of Eastern Europe have not had experience with a type of democratic government like we have, or a constitutional republic, if you will, it doesn't mean that they wouldn't want that if they knew about it. You see, they just haven't learned about it. They haven't had experience with it. And I did debate for the last year or two a former Russian KGB agent, and his argument was that, well, we prefer, because it's all we know, an authoritarian leader with security and stability and us not having to make most of the decisions. But of course we all know that in many of the cities in the Soviet Union and in parts of Eastern Europe, there are many people who do want this type of government. So what I should have said more specifically was that when we support those who are seeking freedom, I certainly mean those who also are seeking a type of government that's similar to ours, but not those who would be preferring some return to authoritarian government, or a Boris Yeltsin, for example, that I certainly don't consider to be one that we should be backing. I mean, Boris Yeltsin is more of a hero now, I suppose, in the wake of the so-called coup than Mikhail Gorbachev is, and this former KGB agent told me, he said, you know, we like Yeltsin, we don't like Gorbachev. We know he's an orthodox communist, and Yeltsin was an orthodox communist, but Boris Yeltsin is a populist figure, and he's an alcoholic who gets drunk and falls off bridges, and that means he's just like most Russians. They can relate to him. That's what he said. But the point is, there are some people in those countries who would like this type of government. It's just that most really don't know anything about it. It's the same situation with regard to free enterprise and market economics. I mean, we can be instructing the current generation, but everything I'm hearing about the experiences of American companies trying to do business there is that there is so much bribery and corruption that there's just no way to get anything done at the moment. So it may take a new generation of kids who study here, but then what do they learn here? That's the irony and what I was trying to point out. If they come to Harvard and they're teaching them about free enterprise and capitalism to go back, I mean, that's the last place in the world you would want to learn, or you would go to learn about free enterprise, capitalistic economics, would be Harvard University. So you see the problem. Where do they go to learn? Yes, sir.
I noticed on the back table there was a book by you about communism and American education, and I was wondering if their influence in education or anywhere else had anything to do with this mindset that we can accept communism.
Well, I think it does. I mean, that book was written many, many years ago, and that's the one that Senator Biden gave to Senator Kennedy, who held up my nomination and who read that word for word. It was a book in which I wrote about the misteaching of communism in American universities, and a survey of the textbooks on Russian and Soviet history, in which they conveniently omitted the destruction of the churches and the murders of the pastors and priests and all of the others in the purges and the Kulak destruction and so forth. I mean, this is just not mentioned in most of these textbooks. So there are a lot of textbooks, and I've been going to conferences sponsored by Accuracy in Academia, in which they're talking today about political correctness, as you know, on college campuses. I mean, somebody who has our point of view would very seldom be invited onto a college campus. And in fact, when we got onto a college campus in the last week, several college campuses in the state of New York, it was not to the general college campus, but through some organization which had all kinds of problems in finding a room that they would allow us to speak in, for example. And then when the posters were put up around the campus, they were torn down immediately. A Polish American who heard me speak at one college wanted to drive an hour to hear me the next night with the video, and he called Vassar and asked him, "Where's Funderburk speaking at 7:30? They said, "We don't know what you're talking about." And he called 4 or 5 offices on the college campus. So, of course, Vassar itself would not invite me, and they would not invite any other anti-communist or pro-freedom American or whatever. But they do invite Ed Asner and Malcolm X's daughter and Angela Davis and Henry Kissinger. And so the students get one point of view for the most part.
Granted that the coup was staged, how do you explain the death of the 3 coup members?
I don't. I can't.
What did they give their lives for?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know that they did this voluntarily.
Maybe they're not dead.
That's true. And that's why it'll certainly be interesting to see if there is, in fact, a trial that takes place for these people, because it's very likely that we might not see such trials, I think. But, you know, one of the books on the table in the back by Anatoly Golitsyn, New Lies for Old, he was the former KGB agent, as I think Tom pointed out, and he wrote a decade ago that the Soviets were going to put in power a Soviet Dubček with a reform face, and he was going to project glasnost or some reform policy, just the facade of the reform, and not really carry out the reforms, or call it a Potemkin village in the historical terms of the Soviet Union. And such things could happen, Golitsyn said, as under this man, as the dismantling of the Berlin Wall, the reunification of Germany, the establishment of multi-party systems in Eastern Europe, and the end of the Warsaw Pact. He said all of these things could take place as part of a massive disinformation campaign to get a bailout financially from the West, because Yuri Andropov, head of the KGB, who tapped Mikhail Gorbachev to be head of the Soviet Union, looked at this guy and explained to him, of course, that we have to undertake drastic measures if we're going to salvage anything because the place is falling apart. He recognized that both of those did, and Andropov recognized that Gorbachev was well suited to help carry this out. And so it's rather curious that somebody that the American media has been saying has been in jeopardy since 1985 and is about to lose his job has always seemed to come out on top inside the Soviet Union. But, you know, we can look at the situation in Eastern Europe and make a very good case for the fact that these so-called revolutions that took place in most of the East European countries came within a week after Gorbachev visited the hardline communist rulers of virtually every one of those countries. So when Gorbachev went to Prague, or he went to, one of his representatives went to Sofia in Bulgaria, within weeks after this, after he gave the signal to the Honeckers and the Zhivkovs and the Kadars and Ceausescu that, look, you know, you're presenting a bad image just like Brezhnev did, and we need a good image, good facade communist. So you step aside for the good of the cause, and we're going to put in one of my people, a Gorbachev protege. So what happened in Romania, what happened in Bulgaria, what happened in Albania, cases in point. In 1989 and 1990, you had called the Communist Party of Bulgaria, the Communist Party of Albania, the Communist Party of Romania. Well, one day it was called the Communist Party, the next day it disbanded and reformed itself as the Socialist Party. So today, the Socialist Party of Bulgaria has the same characters who were communists yesterday, and Albania the same. And in Romania they're called the National Salvation Front. But the leader of Romania's National Salvation Front, when I was ambassador to Romania, I was reading information about what a good communist ally and colleague of Ceausescu he was. And then I found out, not only that, he spent 3.5 years in Moscow at the University of Moscow with Gorbachev. So Iliescu in Romania today is a Gorbachev protege. He was president of the foreign students at the University of Moscow when Gorbachev was president of the Russian students. So everything is not what it appears to be in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. And everything hasn't changed, you know, in real terms. Reports of people coming out of those countries. Obviously some things have in terms of immigration and freedom of travel, and people, religious figures from here can go into there and travel more freely with Bibles and visit churches and things of that nature. But the repression, the secret police organizations, and the Communist Party figures are still in office. And they're getting a better reception in the West. They're getting more money from us. So I think, in view of the fact that Soviet disinformation, deceit, and duplicity have been the essential element of their policy for 74 years, we cannot just discount the possibility that all of a sudden this has ceased to exist, when everything seems to indicate that it has not.
Back in 1989, watching the Romanian Revolution, I noticed that the three major broadcast networks, CNN and C-SPAN, frequently said that the reason for the warehousing of the babies, the so-called orphanages that had so many AIDS patients, was due to the dictator Ceausescu's policy of prohibiting abortion in Romania. What I'd like to know is, to what extent were the warehousing of those babies a result of prohibiting abortion in Romania, and how much of it was the Romanian government's policy of giving incentives to Romanian women to have children out of wedlock? That was my understanding.
Right. Well, I think your point is well taken. The last point is pretty valid, that women felt that they would be penalized if they didn't have more children. And so they were rewarded to some degree for having them. And so many of them had them, and as you point out, out of wedlock, and they became unwanted children, in essence, in large measure because they could not afford to keep them. They didn't have the money or the food possibilities for them. And so this is how you have, even today, 125,000 or 150,000 Romanian orphans and AIDS victims there. So, but the The coup, the so-called revolution that took place in Romania in December of 1989, virtually everybody I've spoken with, including the former head of the secret police of Romania, are convinced that this was staged and orchestrated by the Soviet KGB and GRU. And that's how they wound up with Iliescu, Gorbachev's protege, when if you look at what happened during those days, you see Iliescu coming out there under the lights in the main square, and there's supposedly bullets coming back and forth from the defense and the military fighting against the Securitate of Ceausescu, and the bullets going back and forth, and Iliescu speaking for hours. No bullet gets anywhere near him. When this is all over, what he does is appoint the head of the secret police to be the head of military. He appoints the head of military to be the head of secret police. So, you know, it was all not like it was projected to us. And that's why we have to be concerned that the beast and the monster has not really disappeared yet.
One more question.
Mr. Ambassador, obviously you come from a Christian background. I'm just wondering how you got nominated to be ambassador to Romania with such patriotic feelings. Obviously, you didn't have a transformation overnight. Really, the question is, what pressures were you subjected to by the State Department when you were our ambassador to Romania?
Well, I think I became ambassador probably by accident, or accidental set of circumstances, okay? And it wasn't that they didn't know where I was coming from, because they did find a book that I'd written. And when the media found it, they gave it, as I pointed out, to Kennedy and Biden and Sarbanes and Tsongas, and they all read it in the Senate hearing and asked me to retract everything that was in it and wondered why I said such things as I said. And they did hold my nomination up after they had already passed me through the committee. And one of them even said, Kennedy said, well, should we be sending an anti-communist to represent the United States to a communist country? And, you know, no, of course we ought to be sending a communist to represent the United States. So, but I think what they figured was, and of course you look at the circumstances, it was the first time in 26 years or so that Republicans had a Senate majority, right after Reagan was elected. Reagan was looking around to find people to put in government. He felt he owed a lot of people who had helped elect him through their PACs and through their support in various states. So there were 7 senators who sponsored my nomination or put me on a list for a job of some kind. Ambassador was not really the job at the top of the list. And so my name was thrown in the hopper to be head of East European Affairs in the State Department. And White House personnel called me 6 months later and said, this is reserved for career people in the State Department. You're not eligible, but you've lived in Romania 4 times before. You wrote a dissertation on it, know some of the language, so why don't you throw your name in for ambassador to Romania? We think you're too young and you won't get it, but at least your name will get around. So I think they figured, because the State Department put up another candidate, and Reagan had appointed Al Haig to be Secretary of State, and Al Haig didn't want David Funderburk to be ambassador to Romania. They already had somebody in mind. The conservative Al Haig, you know, he wanted the liberal from the State Department to be ambassador. So it was just political influence that crammed me down their throats, and them figuring, well, we can put a few guys like him out there and circumvent them and ignore them or isolate them. So they ran foreign policy from Eagleburger going into Bucharest on a regular basis, or from wealthy bankers and businessmen in New York carrying actual policy papers right around me and the embassy of 125 employees that you taxpayers were paying for. So we were ignored, and everything that our CIA, DIA, NSA, and all the other offices in the embassy were picking up was essentially thrown in the trash can. So that's how it happened, and I figured they probably thought, well, that's a concession we can manage. But it gave me experience, and I'm grateful for that. Yes.
Quick, final, bottom line question. I want to commend you on your excellent analysis here tonight. I have a confession to make, and that is that I've been watching the State Department for more years than you've been born. And 20 years ago, I wrote a book, The Ordeal of Otto Otepka, which was an expose of the State Department, went through 7 printings, was never reviewed by the New York Times or the Washington Post, incidentally. But nothing has changed, obviously, in all those years, not just the 20 years, but going back some years before that when I was a founder of the National Captive Nations Committee. Nothing has changed. And so the question that I want to ask you is, do you think there is any chance of our ever getting this country back without another real American revolution?
Probably not. That's what we need. And, you know, some things we can do, obviously. We've got to put some people in Congress, find one honest man somewhere who has courage, and let him shine the light on what the State Department is doing, for example. And one key way to get their attention is to freeze the budget of the State Department. And they'll all be squealing like stuck pigs immediately, instantly. And then the media will go after you like sharks and say that you are, you know, opposed to everything good about this country.
You just wrote the resume of Senator Helms.
I wish that were true. Anyway, I think that the difference in what we believe in and what we stand for, and what I found out in Eastern Europe as well, is that we do believe in something that's superior to materialism and political power. So, thank you. God bless you.
Thank you, Ambassador Funderburk. That was excellent. We'll be through here very quickly. We've got a drawing for a book, and that'll be the next thing on the agenda. Do you have that hat or whatever that thing is there? And I'm going to ask this young lady.
For more information on this event, you can write to the Northern chapters of the John Birch Society at Post Office Box number 6 in Clinton, Virginia. The zip code is 22024. Here is a reminder now that for C-SPAN 2 schedule information 24 hours a day, contact our viewer information hotline by calling us here in the nation's capital at area code 202-628-2205. Coming up next, it's the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Colin Powell.
C-SPAN 2 is the only network that brings you gavel-to-gavel coverage of the United States Senate. On Tuesday, the Senate is expected to vote on the confirmation of Judge Clarence Thomas to be an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. Tuesday's session begins at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. The vote is now scheduled for 6 p.m. Eastern Time, 3 p.m. on the West Coast. C-SPAN 2, the only network providing live coverage of the United States Senate, gavel-to-gavel and without commentary.
This past week, we took our cameras to the State Department here in Washington, D.C. for coverage of the 37th General Assembly of the Atlantic Treaty Association, entitled The Alliance and Transatlantic Relations, Changing Issues, New Priorities. This event was attended by several hundred political, diplomatic, and military officials from the 16 member countries of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, and was sponsored by the Atlantic Council of the United States. The Council is a bipartisan nonprofit organization which formulates foreign policy recommendations relating to the democracies of the Atlantic and Pacific communities. It is the U.S. member of the Atlantic Treaty Association, ATA, which was created in 1954 to educate and inform the public about the NATO alliance. We now bring you a portion of that conference featuring a speech by General Colin Powell, who is Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
Our next speaker is here, I'm very happy to say, and it's my pleasure to greet him and introduce him. Don't even sit down, Colin. There comes a time in the affairs of nations and of alliances when they're very, very fortunate to have wise and effective leaders. This is such a time for us in the United States, and I would say for the whole free world. The work that General Powell has done, I think, has provided a model of how the military can effectively serve the higher purposes of government and of people. We are privileged to have him with us this morning, and I give you my friend and colleague, General Colin Powell.
thank you very, very much, Andy, my dear friend, for your kind words. I am honored to have been asked to be with you again. It's been 2 years since I had an occasion to speak to the association, and honored to be here so early to kick off a distinguished array of speakers who you'll be hearing from the course of the day. Normally I get to follow, and I try to follow my boss, Dick Cheney, and let him warm up the crowd and take all the tough questions.